All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are tackling a conflict that completely redrew the map of the world. We're talking about a war fought not just in one place, but everywhere, in the deep forests of America, across the battlefields of Europe, and all the way to the coasts of India. It's a war that some people, pretty smart people, have called the real First World War. So let me just throw this out there. What if the first true global conflict didn't kick off in 1914 with trenches and tanks, but way back in 1754, in the American backwoods of all places? And what if it all started with a little skirmish involving a young, super ambitious guy from Virginia you might have heard of? And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't some new, clever reinterpretation by modern historians. Nope. A guy named Winston Churchill himself called the Seven Years' War exactly that. He got it. He knew this wasn't just another petty European squabble over who gets to sit on which throne. This was a full-on global throwdown for empire. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start right where the shooting started, out on the American frontier. Then we're going to watch as this little fire spreads and the whole map just expands, pulling in all the big players in Europe. From there, we'll see how this thing went truly global. And finally, we'll look at the aftermath and see how the end of this war created a totally new world order. So our story doesn't begin in some fancy palace in Paris or London. Nah. It starts in the wild, dense, and seriously contested wilderness of the Ohio Valley. See, after the last big European war wrapped up in 1748, this huge chunk of land, packed with valuable fur-trapping territory, became a major flashpoint. Both the British and the French were like, that's mine! And with tensions that high, you just knew it was about to explode. And here it is, the spark, May 1754. A 22-year-old lieutenant colonel, get this, named George Washington, is leading a small band of Virginia militiamen. He ends up ambushing a French diplomatic patrol. It was a messy, confusing, and pretty small encounter, but oh my gosh, the consequences were massive. This one little firefight in the woods lit the fuse on what Americans would soon call the French and Indian War. You know, the first few years were just a total disaster for the British in America. A year after that first skirmish, a huge expedition led by General Edward Braddock, with Washington tagging along as an aide, marched on the French Fort Duquesne. They walked straight into an ambush at the Battle of the Monongahela. It was an absolute catastrophe. We're talking nearly 1,000 British soldiers killed or wounded. And the crazy part? War hadn't even been officially declared back in Europe yet. That didn't happen until 1756. By then, the American frontier was already a war zone. Now here's where things get really fascinating. This little brush fire in the colonies gets yanked back across the Atlantic. It's like a giant magnet, pulling in all the old grudges, all the ancient rivalries simmering in Europe, and just reigniting a massive conflict on a continental scale. So the teams get shuffled in what historians call the diplomatic revolution. It's wild. Britain realizes it needs a tough guy on the continent to protect the king's home turf of Hanover, so they buddy up with Prussia, this up-and-coming military powerhouse. Well, this move completely spooks France, who then does the unthinkable and allies with its old archenemy, Austria. Before you know it, Russia and Sweden jump in on that side, forming this massive coalition with basically one goal: to absolutely flatten Prussia. And standing right in the middle of this European hurricane, facing it all, was one man, Frederick II of Prussia, a king who, through just pure grit and genius, would go down in history as Frederick the Great. Frederick was such a character. They called him an enlightened despot, which is just a fancy way of saying he wrote poetry and was pen pals with the philosopher Voltaire, but he was also a totally ruthless military commander. I mean, the man was completely surrounded. He was facing the armies of 5 different nations all at once. And he survived. How? Through sheer brilliance. He used lightning-fast marches and incredibly bold tactics to smash his much, much larger enemies at key battles like Rossbach and Leuthen. His survival against all odds is what put Prussia on the map as a major European power for good. Okay, but this raises a really important question. Prussia is fighting for its life, sure, but Britain? Britain is fighting a war literally all over the planet, from North America to India. How in the world did they pay for all of this? Well, the answer isn't on a battlefield. It's in the accounting ledgers of London. See, Britain had pioneered a totally revolutionary way to pay for its wars: national debt. Just look at these numbers, a sample of loans from the Bank of England. The government's borrowing just exploded during the war. This ability to raise absolutely insane amounts of cash was their superpower. This really was Britain's secret weapon.
It wasn't a new kind of cannon or a faster ship. It was the Bank of England and a sophisticated financial system. It allowed the British government to borrow staggering sums of money, not just to fund its own armies, but to pay its allies, like Prussia, to keep fighting. Britain could, quite literally, outspend its enemies until they gave up.
And this just perfectly highlights the difference with France. France had nothing like this. The cost of this war, and then doubling down by helping the Americans in their revolution, basically pushed the French government to the edge of total bankruptcy. And that financial chaos, it was a direct line to the social unrest that would eventually explode into the French Revolution a few decades later. So let's recap. We've got a war raging in America, we've got a massive war in Europe, and it's all being funded by a financial revolution in London. But it didn't stop there. The rivalry between Britain and France for colonies and trade was so intense that basically anywhere their interests overlapped, fighting broke out. This conflict just spread like wildfire. Over in India, the British East India Company smashed the French and cemented its control over the subcontinent. Out on the high seas, the Royal Navy annihilated the French fleet at Quiberon Bay, which ended any real chance of France invading Britain. In the Caribbean, they were slugging it out over tiny islands that produced immense wealth from sugar. And then Spain decides to jump in late on France's side, so Britain helps its old ally Portugal fight off a Spanish invasion. I mean, look at this map. This was a world at war. So after years and years of this brutal, globe-spanning war, the fighting finally wound down, and the peace treaty they all signed in Paris in 1763, well, it did a lot more than just end the war. It basically took the map of the world, ripped it up, and drew a whole new one. The final score was, well, it was a blowout. France got kicked out of North America, period. They had to hand over Canada and all their land east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. Then, to make things even more complicated, they gave the massive Louisiana Territory to their buddy Spain. The result of all this, Britain was left as the undisputed #1 dominant colonial power on the entire planet. The French philosopher Voltaire, trying to save face, famously sniffed that Canada was nothing more than a few acres of snow anyway. Yeah, right. But here is the ultimate beautiful irony of Britain's complete and total victory. For generations, the American colonists had lived under the constant threat of the French and their Native American allies on their doorstep. Now, with that threat totally and completely gone, a lot of colonists started to look around and ask a very dangerous question. Wait, why do we need British soldiers and British taxes anymore? The fallout from this war was incredibly complicated. For the American colonists, yeah, they got a new sense of security and even a new American identity, but they also got a whole bunch of new taxes from a British government that was drowning in war debt. For the Native American tribes who had sided with the French, the outcome was an absolute catastrophe. Their main ally and trading partner was just gone, replaced by an ever-expanding and often hostile British presence. This led straight into another war, Pontiac's War, and a new British rule, the Proclamation of 1763, that banned colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, which of course made the colonists furious. And that right there brings us to the final, crucial domino to fall. To pay off the mountain of debt they racked up winning this global empire, Britain looked at the American colonies and saw a piggy bank. They started imposing new taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, designed to make the colonists pay for their own defense. But the colonists saw it as an attack on their fundamental rights. And those grievances, sparked by the cost of this war, would lead directly to the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, and the American Revolution. So, in the end, the 7 Years' War made Great Britain the master of the world. But in winning everything, it planted the seeds of its own empire's destruction. It really makes you think, and it's the question I want to leave you with. Was winning the First World War the very thing that cost Britain its American colonies?